Lecture 26, Emotion. Since the beginning of psychology as an empirical science, problems of cognition have been at the forefront of psychological research and theory. The 19th century psychophysicists like Weber and Fechner, the physiological psychologists like Helmholtz, and the earliest investigators of learning like Pavlov and Thorndike were all concerned with the philosophical debate between nativism and empiricism, and were interested in how we acquire knowledge. But cognition isn't all there is to the mind. There's also emotion and motivation. Remember Kant, who argued that there are three absolutely irreducible faculties of mind: knowledge, feeling, and desire. Cognition in the form of sensation, perception, memory, thinking, reasoning, learning, problem-solving, and language is now fairly well understood, but psychologists haven't ignored problems of emotion and motivation. And in this lecture and the next one, I want to complete the trilogy of mind by talking about some of our understanding of emotion and motivation. First, let's define some terms. This turns out not to be so easy, because although emotion is a term that probably each of us uses at least once a day, psychologists have had a lot of difficulty defining the term. One popular definition of emotion is in terms of brief adaptive responses involving physiological and cognitive reactions to objects, people, and situations. A definition that, frankly, doesn't do anything to distinguish emotion from perception or sensation. A better definition of emotion is to focus on the unique subjective experience of emotion, which has to do with feeling. An emotion is an internal mental state consisting of subjective feelings that we can describe as pleasantness versus unpleasantness. This feeling state, this feeling of pleasantness or unpleasantness, positive or negative feelings, is what makes emotion distinct from cognition and motivation. Psychologists will often use terms such as mood and emotion interchangeably, but there's an important distinction between them. A mood is a pervasive global feeling of pleasure or pain, attraction or revulsion. It has a relatively low intensity, and in a sense it's more mental than physical. Emotions, by contrast, have more specific content. You feel happy or sad about some particular thing. They are relatively high in intensity. There's a fair amount of excitement and agitation surrounding our emotional states. And while emotional states are definitely mental states, there's also a physical aspect to them that's lacking in mood. Our hearts race when we're anxious. We smile and laugh when we're happy. Our faces flush when we're embarrassed. We get red-faced with anger. So there's a difference between mood and emotion. They're two different kinds of affective experiences. But again, psychologists often use these terms interchangeably, and I'm sure I will too in this lecture. While the 19th century psychologists focused mostly on cognitive problems of sensation, perception, and learning, they didn't ignore feeling. They didn't ignore emotion entirely. And in fact, Wilhelm Wundt argued that any emotional experience could be decomposed into three elements or three dimensions. First was a dimension of pleasantness versus unpleasantness. Is it a good feeling or a bad feeling? Second, excitement versus calm. You can be pleasantly content or you can be deliriously happy. And finally, a dimension of strain versus relaxation. You can seethe with anger or you can be just about to burst. Wundt's colleagues argued with him about excitement versus calm and strain versus relaxation, but everybody at the time agreed that pleasantness versus unpleasantness is the basic dimension of feeling, a distinction between positive and negative feeling states. And this, in turn, yields a basic one-dimensional two-category scheme for classifying emotional experiences. But Wundt was definitely onto something. There's more to emotional experience than just whether the emotion is positive or negative, pleasant or unpleasant. In fact, Russell proposed that you needed two independent dimensions to classify various emotional states. First, as with Wundt, a dimension of positive versus negative affect, more or less pleasant versus more or less unpleasant emotional states. And second, a dimension of high versus low arousal. When we're alarmed or astonished, we're highly aroused. When we're tired or calm or bored, we're not so aroused. Something like Russell's affect circumplex, this two-dimensional arrangement of emotional states, is probably the most popular view of emotion, both among psychologists and among people at large. But as intuitively appealing as something like the Russell affect circumplex is, it might not necessarily be right. While we usually think of positive and negative affect as polar opposites, the more positive affect you have, the less negative affect you have, and vice versa, David Watson and Auke Tellegen have suggested that positive and negative affect are, in fact, two independent dimensions of emotional experience. As they put it, affect may be descriptively bipolar, positive and negative, but in fact, when you look at it in detail, the structure is unipolar. We go from low to high positive affect and low to high levels of negative affect. Only the high end of each dimension represents emotional arousal, and the low end of each dimension reflects a kind of absence of affective involvement. Both solutions to the structure of affect, Russell's and Watson and Tellegen's, demonstrate what's known as a circumplex structure, a circular arrangement of dimensions where the angular distances between dimensions reflect the correlations between them. So for Russell, positive and negative affect are separated by 180 degrees. They're polar opposites. But for Watson and Tellegen, positive and negative affect are separated by 90 degrees. They're independent of each other. The implication is that you can be high on positive affect and high on negative affect at the same time, or low on both. In fact, if you look at it, you'll see that the two circumplexes are more alike than they are different. You can derive one from the other simply by rotating its axes by 45 degrees. But there are reasons for preferring the Watson and Tellegen structure. They've shown experimentally that pure measures of positive and negative affect are actually uncorrelated with each other. You'll see this situation later in the lecture on gender, when we'll discuss an argument that masculinity and femininity, though intuitively polar opposites, the more masculine you are, the less feminine you are, they actually turn out to be independent of each other as well, so that people can be high on masculinity and high on femininity, or for that matter, low on both, or any other point in between. Here's an example where research actually counters our intuitions. We think that positive and negative emotions are opposite to each other, but in fact they might not be. But there's clearly more to emotion than positive and negative affect. There are particular kinds of emotions, ways of feeling good or feeling bad. Schwartz and Shaver took a linguistic approach to this question, asking people to categorize their various emotional experiences. They extracted a variety of emotion terms from the dictionary and then had their subjects sort them according to similarity. This sorting exercise yielded 5 basic categories of emotion: love, including such emotions as liking and passion; happiness, joy and ecstasy; anger, frustration, rage, resentment, disgust, and envy; sadness, agony, grief, disappointment, guilt, loneliness, and pity; and fear, alarm, fright, and anxiety. They classified surprise as a 6th category, but they actually characterized surprise as what they called a pre-emotion. resulting from a violation of expectancies, and surprise can be either positive or negative. We often think about our emotions as unified experiences, but Peter Lang pointed out that in fact there are several components to every emotional state. According to Lang, every emotional response consists of several components. Verbal cognitive, corresponding to the person's subjective feeling state, for example, of fear. Overt motor or behavioral responses, such as escape or avoidance. And a covert physiological response mediated by the autonomic and skeletal nervous systems, such as a change in the electrical properties of the skin or a change in heart rate. When all three of these systems act together, the person experiences intense emotional arousal. But any emotional experience can be decomposed into these three components: verbal cognitive, overt motor, and covert physiological. Now that we know what emotions are, the next question is, why do people feel the way they do? Why do they feel happy or sad, guilty or proud, or whatever it is that they feel? For a long time, the most prominent theory of emotional experience and expression was known as the James Lange theory, formulated first by William James, the American psychologist, in 1884, and independently offered by Carl Lange, a Danish psychologist, in 1885. For both James and Lange, any external event will elicit some bodily response, just like as a reflex. This bodily response will consist of a set of autonomic reactions and also a set of motor behaviors, like the behaviors associated with approach and avoidance. James and Lange proposed that it's the person's perception of these efferent activities, perception of these bodily responses, is experienced as an emotion, and therefore that each emotion is generated by a different pattern of bodily activity. James focused on responses of the whole body, both autonomic and skeletal nervous systems. Lange, for his part, focused just on visceral responses, responses that are mediated by the autonomic nervous system alone. The James Lange theory of emotion is in some respects counterintuitive because it seems to reverse the usual direction of causation. When we usually think about emotions, we think about emotions causing our behavior. I feel afraid, so I avoid an object. I feel attraction, so I approach an object. But that's not what the James Lange theory argues. The James Lange theory argues that it's our reaction, our bodily reaction to an object, causes the emotion, because our emotion is the perception of these bodily reactions. The James Lange theory was very popular and very influential, I think, frankly, mostly on the basis of James's extraordinary reputation. But it has some problems, and it didn't take long for psychologists such as Walter B. Cannon to offer a set of objections to the James Lange theory. The first of these is that organisms, including people, still feel emotions even when their spinal cord is severed from their brain. You can see this, for example, in dogs or cats whose spinal cord has been severed. They'll still show a fear reaction if they're provoked in the right way. And paraplegics, people who have lost all sensation from the neck on down because of a break very high in the spinal cord, they still experience emotional responses to various kinds of objects, even though there's no afferent feedback from the skeletal musculature or the viscera. Second, Cannon argued that different emotional states aren't associated with different patterns of physiological response. That what happens physiologically when we're happy or sad or angry or disgusted doesn't differ among those various kinds of states. All emotional states seem to have physiological arousal in common, but for Cannon at least they seem to have the same pattern of physiological arousal no matter what the emotion was. Third, Cannon argued that people's perception of visceral responses to stimuli are very diffuse and nonspecific. We don't really have a good sense of what's going on in our bodies. We can't feel changes in our blood pressure, for example. So if different emotions don't show different patterns of physiological activity, and if our perceptions of physiological activity aren't very good to begin with, it's really hard to argue, as James and Lange did, that an emotion consists of our perception of our physiological responses to stimulation. Fourth, Cannon argued that our autonomic responses occur more slowly than our emotional reactions. When we see an emotional stimulus, our reaction to it is immediate: fear, surprise, happiness, disgust, anger, whatever. But the bodily response recruits much more slowly. And finally, Cannon argued that manipulation of a person's autonomic response doesn't really alter his or her emotional state. You can get somebody's heart going really fast by exercise, for example, and they don't necessarily feel one way or the other about it. Or you can give somebody a drug that will dampen a person's physiological arousal, and their emotional reactions still won't change. Note, however, that all of these criticisms are really directed against the visceral component of emotional response. They're really directed against Carl Lange's theory. William James, for his part, emphasized motor feedback, feedback from the skeletal musculature, in his famous formulation, "When we see a bear and feel afraid, we feel afraid because we perceive ourselves as running away from the bear." So despite the power of Cannon's critique, and it was very powerful, it's still possible that James had it right even if Cannon didn't, and that emotions are reflective of feedback from our skeletal musculature as opposed to our viscera. This is a point I'll come back to in a little while. Cannon's critique in turn led to the formulation of what's now known as a general arousal theory of the emotions. This theory basically says that emotional states reflect a single undifferentiated state of physiological arousal. Any apparent qualitative differences among emotions, the difference between joy and surprise, between anger and fear, are differences in intensity levels, not qualitative differences in patterns of physiological response. But of course, this resolution didn't satisfy anybody. Simple introspection reveals that there are qualitative differences among emotions independent of arousal. Anger isn't just a greater or lesser state of arousal, it's a specifically different emotion compared to disgust or fear or any of the other negative emotions. So Cannon persuaded us that all emotional states have a single pattern of physiological arousal in common. But introspection tells us that we have qualitatively different emotional states like happiness and fear and anger. Where do these come from? The puzzle remained unsolved for a long time until in the early 60s, Stanley Schachter and Jerome Singer proposed a cognitive evaluation theory of emotion. From their point of view, an emotional state is a cognitive construction. They argued that the first thing that happens is that some stimulus event elicits autonomic arousal. This autonomic arousal is undifferentiated and it's unexplained, at least for the moment. This state of physiological arousal is then interpreted by the person, an interpretation that's shaped by whatever information is available to the person in the current environment. And so the emotional state that the person experiences reflects the attribution of arousal, the person's explanation of why he or she is aroused. Put another way, emotion is produced by the individual's cognitive assessment, cognitive evaluation of undifferentiated physiological arousal. The implication being that unexplained arousal is affectively neutral, but the explanation of arousal creates the emotional state of fear or anger or disgust or happiness or whatever. The Schachter-Singer theory was based on the results of an experiment that quickly became a classic in the literature on emotion. First, Schachter and Singer recruited a group of subjects for an experiment on the effects of a new vitamin on mental performance. Upon arrival in the laboratory, the subjects were injected with this substance, which was described to them as a vitamin derivative, and then they were asked to perform various tasks. The substance was not, in fact, a vitamin. It was, in fact, epinephrine, a drug that stimulates physiological arousal. Half the subjects were informed that they would feel physiological arousal as a side effect of the injection, but the other half weren't told of this side effect. They were still going to feel physiological arousal as a result of the injection of epinephrine, but they were ignorant about why they were physiologically aroused. The subjects then completed the experiment working in pairs, but the experimenters had another trick up their sleeve, which was that only one of these subjects in each pair was a real subject. The other was a confederate of the experimenter. In one condition of the experiment, the euphoria condition of the experiment, the confederate was instructed to act in a happy, giddy, light-hearted way. In the other condition of the experiment, the anger condition, the confederate was instructed to act in a hostile, angry, aggressive manner. There were also placebo conditions in which the subjects were injected with an inert physiological substance, and there was a neutral condition where the confederate didn't do anything special. For purposes of this exposition, I've eliminated those conditions. At some point during the experiment, the subjects were asked to rate their mood, how happy they felt, and how angry and irritated they felt. The finding was that the subjects' moods were influenced by the behavior of the confederate. But only the subjects in the ignorant condition, the subjects who weren't informed that physiological arousal would occur as a result of their injection. So the uninformed subjects who participated in the company of the euphoric, happy, giddy confederate felt relatively happy compared to subjects who were informed about the side effects of the drug. Similarly, the subjects exposed to the angry confederate were in a more negative mood. They felt less happy than those who were informed about these side effects. So the conclusion is that the subjects in both conditions felt physiologically aroused. They didn't know that this was because of the drug they'd been injected with, so they searched the environment for something that would explain why they felt the way they did. The subjects who were exposed to the happy confederate interpreted their arousal as happiness. The subjects who were exposed to the angry confederate interpreted their arousal as anger. So, as Schachter and Singer wrote, precisely the same state of physiological arousal could be labeled as joy or fury or jealousy or any of a great diversity of emotional labels depending on the cognitive aspects of the situation. For Schachter and Singer, our emotional states are cognitive constructions that depend on our interpretation of the circumstances in which we experience undifferentiated physiological arousal. The Schachter and Singer theory quickly became conventional wisdom in psychology about the nature of emotion. But it has at least one problem, which is, how do we get aroused in the first place? In the Schachter-Singer experiment, subjects became aroused by virtue of receiving an injection of a drug, epinephrine. But that's not how most of us get aroused. George Mandler, a psychologist first at Yale and retired now from the University of California, San Diego, expanded the Schachter-Singer cognitive evaluation theory by placing emphasis on the arousal component, asking the question of what leads to emotional arousal in the first place. And what Mandler argued was that arousal is a response to the experience of a perceptual cognitive discrepancy, a violation of our expectations, an interruption of our intentions, or a disruption of habitual behavior. When any of these things occur, Mandler argued, physiological arousal occurs as a result. This arousal is undifferentiated with respect to the stimulus situation. It's the same arousal no matter how the discrepancy occurs. Then this arousal elicits attentional activity so that the person will scan the environment for the cause of the discrepancy. After that, things work out pretty much the way Schachter and Singer argued that they worked out. We interpret our arousal in accordance with the context in which the arousal occurred. Mandler's theory is especially interesting because it entails a new function for the autonomic nervous system. In the lectures on the biological bases of mind and behavior, I told you that the autonomic nervous system was involved in homeostatic regulation. But Mandler argued that the autonomic nervous system also alerts the organism and marks certain objects and events as important. The valence, the quality of emotional state, is then determined by cognitive evaluation, the person's perception of the source of the discrepancy. Whereas George Mandler focused on the origins of the arousal component of emotion, Craig Smith and Phoebe Ellsworth focused on the evaluation component, based on earlier ideas formulated by Richard Lazarus. That is, trying to identify precisely what appraisals underlie the various emotions. They assumed, along with Schachter and Singer, that emotional experience is linked to our appraisal of the environment. But they don't assume that emotions are pure cognitive constructions. They are willing to concede that there may be different patterns of bodily response associated with the various emotions. They're agnostic about that issue. But still, they agree with the general thrust of the Schachter-Singer theory that our emotional states don't simply reflect patterns of physiological activity, but also reflect some sort of cognitive evaluation or appraisal. They argued that our evaluation of emotional stimuli proceed in terms of 6 different dimensions. First, its pleasantness, its feeling, or its valence, whether it's positive or negative. Second, the amount of effort that's anticipated. Does the subject have to do something, or can the person do nothing? The third dimension is one of certainty or predictability. Another dimension is the amount of attentional activity or the intensity of cognitive focus. And then finally, there are dimensions of attributional activity. How much situational control is there versus control by a human agent? If there's control by a human agent, how much control is the responsibility of the person, him or herself, and how much control resides in the hands of other people? To see how this works, consider the distinction between 2 positive emotions, happiness and pride. Both are highly pleasant emotional states. Neither of them requires much effort. If you feel happiness or pride, you feel happiness or pride about something that's already happened. You don't have to do anything more. They both involve high levels of certainty. If you feel happy or proud, the thing you're happy about or the thing you're proud about, you're pretty certain that's a good thing. Both entail a strong desire to pay attention, both to the emotional state itself and also to the object that elicits the emotional state. So happiness and pride have an awful lot in common, but they do differ in terms of attributional activity. You can be happy about lots of things, including lots of things that are completely free of your control, things you didn't have any responsibility for. You can be happy when you see children playing or when your friend gets married. But in order to feel pride, there has to be a dimension of human control. Some human agent has to be responsible for the thing about which you're proud. And that's usually yourself. You take pride in your own accomplishments. Now, of course, you can take pride in the accomplishments of somebody else as well, your wife or your child or your parent. But the point is that pride reflects some kind of attribution to the work of a human agent, whereas in happiness there's less attributional activity of any kind. You're just happy. Cognitive evaluation theories of emotion of the sort proposed by Schachter and Singer, Richard Lazarus, Craig and Ellsworth dominated psychology in the 1960s and 1970s, but beginning in the 1980s they were challenged by the resurgence of a psychobiological view of emotion, a view that harkens back to the James Lange theory and the idea that emotions reflect different patterns of physiological response to a stimulus event. Of particular interest was feedback from the motor activity on the face. The idea being, a la William James, that different emotional states reflected the perception of different patterns of motor activity in the facial musculature. And the facial feedback hypothesis, the hypothesis that emotions reflected feedback from the facial musculature, began with the work of Sylvan Tompkins in the early 1960s, but wasn't really appreciated until the 1980s. Tompkins drew on earlier work that had identified three dimensions in the facial expression of emotions. First, pleasantness versus unpleasantness. We make different kinds of faces when we're having a pleasant experience than when we're making an unpleasant experience. The second dimension is one of rejection versus attention. And a third dimension, one of activation versus relaxation. Tompkins argued that there was a small set of primary emotions that were associated with innate neural programs. We were born to have these particular kinds of emotional expressions. Babies smile when they're tickled, they scream when they're wet, and they turn up their noses when you put something bad tasting in their mouths. So Tompkins argued that these innate neural programs were automatically activated by certain kinds of stimuli, and that one result of the activation of these neural programs was a specific facial display of emotion. This facial display has one obvious function, which is to communicate our reaction to the stimulus to other people. But Tompkins also argued that feedback from this facial display generated our subjective experience of emotion. So this is very much like James's version of the James Lange theory, except that the skeletal musculature in question isn't the musculature of the entire body, person running from a bear, but just the skeletal musculature associated with the face. Certain stimuli elicit certain facial responses by virtue of an innate neural program, and it's our perception of this facial activity that generates the emotional state. Tompkins' work in turn has its roots in the evolutionary theories of Charles Darwin, who wrote a book entitled The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals. In that book, Darwin postulated that there were specific fundamental emotions that were expressed similarly across a wide variety of species, especially on the face. These facial expressions of emotion are part of our phylogenetic heritage. Now Darwin, in his work, emphasized the facial expression of emotion, implying that the emotional state comes first and it's expressed on the face as a kind of nonverbal communication to other people of what the individual's internal emotional state is. If you've ever spent any time with a dog, you know it's not too hard to read happiness, sadness, fear, and anger on a dog's face. And Darwin simply noted that we read these emotions in humans in exactly the same way. And he postulated that the reason for this is that these facial expressions of emotion have been wired into us, they're innate, wired into us by evolution. Based largely on Darwin's evolutionary theory, Paul Ekman, a psychologist at the University of California, San Francisco, who was in fact a student of Sylvan Tompkins, has proposed that there is a small set of basic emotions, each associated with a particular facial expression. These facial expressions are part of our biological endowment. They're pre-wired, they're innate, they occur automatically, and in some sense they're non-cognitive. They're like reflexive responses to particular kinds of stimuli. These facial expressions are motor signs of our emotional experience. They communicate our internal emotional states to other people. Ekman proposed that there were at least 6 of these basic emotions, innately pre-wired automatic emotional expressions that can be read from the face: happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, and disgust. There may be others. There is some controversy about interest and pain and surprise, for example. Ekman's theory has 2 important implications. First, these emotions are basic. They're universal, not just among humans, but among primates, if not mammals as well, as the dog example in the last slide showed you. The second implication is that emotion has a non-cognitive aspect to it. There's a specific neural circuitry which provides direct emotional response to certain kinds of stimuli, unmediated by any cognitive evaluation. So whereas Schachter and Singer and Smith and Ellsworth and Lazarus proposed that cognitive evaluation was critical to emotional experience, Ekman has proposed that, at least for these basic emotions, these basic emotions are fundamentally non-cognitive. Perhaps other emotional states rely on cognitive constructions, perhaps like blends of emotion or something like that, but these basic emotions are fundamentally non-cognitive. They're a result of how our nervous systems are wired. Ekman's theory is very important because, if confirmed, it effectively answers Cannon's critique of James. There are differential patterns of physiological activity associated with at least these basic emotions, but the pattern of activity is to be found in the motor system, not in the viscera, and it's going to be found in the motor system above the neck, on the face, which, for example, is why quadriplegics can experience emotions. Quadriplegics don't get muscle feedback from below the neck, but they do get it from the face. Whereas Tompkins and others have proposed that feedback from the facial musculature is critical to emotion, Robert Zients has proposed yet another mechanism that gets us from the face to emotion without involving motor feedback in what he calls a vascular theory of emotional efference. Zients has proposed that the movement of certain facial muscles affects our patterns of breathing, and that our breathing regulates the cooling and heating of the brain. The cooling and heating of the brain in turn alters the actions of certain neurotransmitters. So if you increase the temperature of the brain, you lower people's hedonic tone. They feel less pleasant. If you decrease the temperature of the brain, you increase hedonic tone. People feel more pleasant. Feelings of pleasantness and unpleasantness, though, aren't generated by feedback from the facial musculature. Rather, they're generated by the brain itself. Facial action cools the blood flowing into and around the brain, and the temperature of the blood flowing into and around the brain changes brain temperature, which in turn affects the function of certain neurotransmitters. This is a highly speculative theory, as you might imagine, though there's some evidence supporting it. But while the vascular theory of emotional efference can account for positive and negative moods, feelings of good or bad, it can't account for discrete emotional states, different ways of feeling bad, like being angry or being sad or being afraid. Howard Leventhal, another student of Sylvan Tompkins, has offered an alternative perceptual motor theory of emotion. For Leventhal, the study of emotion starts with conscious experience, not with facial activity. For him, emotional states are a form of meaning. They provide information about the self and the world. These basic meanings develop in what Leventhal calls the perceptual processing system, by which he means the cognitive system in general. But Leventhal also agrees that emotion is a form of automatic motor activity, that there are certain patterns of motor activity, including on the face, but not limited to the face, that are controlled by concrete sensations and perceptions. The processing of emotion, then, moves through three different levels. First, a level of expressive motor processing, which generates both subjective feelings of emotion and expressive reactions. Second, what Leventhal calls a schematic perceptual memory, which stores our knowledge of both emotions and the situations in which they occur. Schematic perceptual memory contains a stored record of our various emotional experiences, different emotional episodes, and these memories are automatically activated by appropriate stimulus situations. Aspects of the stimulus environment serve as cues to the retrieval of emotional episodes from memory. This retrieval provides for a very rapid evaluation of the emotional significance of some event. Finally, there is a conceptual abstract memory, kind of like semantic memory, which contains our abstract verbal knowledge about emotion. It also contains nonverbal codes for recognizing and enacting emotions, a kind of procedural memory. So emotional states reflect motor responses to situations, but they also reflect cognitive activity. Partly our emotional reactions reflect innate stimulus response mechanisms of the sort postulated by Ekman, and for that matter Tompkins, and partly our emotional life reflects cognitive evaluations of the sort proposed by Schachter and Singer and Ellsworth and Craik. Emotions are not purely physiological, but neither are they purely cognitive. Modern neuroscientific approaches to emotion have their origins in the hypothalamic theory of emotion proposed originally by Walter B. Cannon and subsequently developed by Philip Bard. You'll remember that Cannon and Bard were very critical of the James Lange theory of emotion. While James and Lange argued that emotions stemmed from activity in the peripheral nervous system, Cannon and Bard argued for the importance of the central nervous system, and specifically the hypothalamus, which they argued generated various emotional states. Discharges from the hypothalamus to the brainstem were responsible for emotional behavior, including things like facial expressions, while discharges from the hypothalamus to the cerebral cortex were responsible for the subjective experience of emotion. Cannon's hypothalamic theory of emotion was subsequently expanded by James Papez, who proposed that emotional responses involved a whole circuit of brain structures, not just the hypothalamus. In his view, an emotional stimulus was first processed by the thalamus, which, you remember, serves as a kind of sensory relay station, directing sensory impulses to the appropriate part of the cerebral cortex. The thalamus sends information about the stimulus to the sensory cortex, where it's processed further, but the thalamus also sends signals to the hypothalamus, which generates the bodily response to the stimulus. Both the hypothalamus and the sensory projection areas send signals to the cingulate cortex, another structure in the limbic system that generates the subjective feeling state associated with an emotion. Papez's circuit then consists of a number of structures: the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the thalamus, the cingulate cortex, all of which are involved in generating the subjective feeling of emotion and the bodily expression of that emotional state. Later, MacLean found a place for emotion in his triune theory of brain organization. Remember that MacLean distinguished between the so-called reptilian brain, consisting of the brainstem and the cerebellum, the limbic system, and the neocortex, or the new brain characteristic of mammals and primates. For MacLean, the limbic system was the mediator of our emotional lives. So emotions reflect the activity of a fairly primitive portion of the mammalian brain. And MacLean gave particular emphasis to the amygdala, to which he assigned the responsibility for organizing our emotional responses to stimuli. For Cannon, the hypothalamus was the seat of all emotions. For Papez, all emotions involved the same circuit of brain structures, not just the hypothalamus, but also the hippocampus, the thalamus, and the cingulate cortex. MacLean similarly focused on the role of emotional circuits in what he called the visceral brain, or the limbic system. The implication of these theories is that the same brain structures are involved in all emotions. But that raises the question of, how do we get discrete emotional states? How do we get happiness and sadness, anger and fear? Most recently, Joseph Ledoux has proposed that there are separate modules in the brain, or separate systems of modules in the brain, each responsible for a particular emotional state. And in his own theoretical work, Ledoux has emphasized the role of the amygdala in generating fear responses. Ledoux begins by agreeing with Papez that everything begins with the thalamus, the sensory relay station that projects both to the cerebral cortex and to the amygdala. The cerebral cortex creates a conscious representation of the stimulus in working memory. It also retrieves information about the stimulus event stored in long-term memory. The amygdala, for its part, generates both the behavioral and the physiological response to the emotional stimulus, to the fear stimulus. The autonomic nervous system preparing the organism for fight or flight, and the skeletal musculature actually engaging in flight or fight. The amygdala, in turn, also passes information about its activities to the cerebral cortex, which then generates the subjective experience of emotion, in this case, fear. So if you think about the three components of an emotion that were described by Peter Lang, the subjective experience of emotion is generated by the cortex, but the overt behavioral component of emotion and the covert physiological component of emotion, they're generated by the amygdala. Ledoux has focused on the specific emotion of fear and the role of the amygdala in generating fear responses. But the implication of his theory of fear is that a similar story could be told about the other basic emotions. But presumably the amygdala is not involved in those. There are other structures analogous to the amygdala that generate happiness, anger, disgust, surprise, the other basic emotions. In fact, the latest turn in the psychology of emotion has been the emergence of a program of affective neuroscience, similar to the program of cognitive neuroscience, that's dedicated to a program of uncovering the modules and systems of modules in the brain that generate our emotional lives in the same way that cognitive neuroscientists have tried to discover the modules in the brain that are responsible for various aspects of perception and memory and thinking and language. And already there's considerable progress to report. We know from the work of Ledoux and others that the amygdala is critical for the production of fear and may be involved in other negative emotions as well. The orbitofrontal cortex appears to play a critical role in the regulation of emotion. The anterior cingulate gyrus seems to be specialized for processing information about discrepancies in experience, the kinds of discrepancies that Mandler suggested lead to emotional arousal in the first place. The nucleus accumbens seems to be involved in the generation of positive emotional states, like happiness. And the insula, located so close to the olfactory lobe, seems to be involved in feelings of disgust. James was right. Various emotions are associated with differential patterns of motor activity, especially motor activity on the face. But Cannon was right too. Emotions are generated centrally, not peripherally. But we now understand that the emotional action is not in the hypothalamus, but rather in the amygdala and other brain structures that seem to be specialized for the generation of particular emotional states. But the hypothalamus isn't completely out of the picture. We'll see how it plays a role in motivation in the next lecture.